There's a notebook in a museum basement in Ulaanbaatar that almost no one has ever asked to see. The pages are yellowed now, brittle at the edges, filled with pencil sketches and measurements written in a careful hand. On page 47, there's a drawing of something that shouldn't exist. A single stone, roughly the size of a human fist, covered in markings that follow no known pattern. Below the sketch, a date, April 19, 1924. Below that, 3 words underlined twice. Context makes no sense. The man who drew this was not famous. His name was Mikhail Grachev, a junior geologist attached to an expedition that history has mostly forgotten. He was 26 years old. He had been in the Gobi for 8 months, and he was beginning to suspect that everything he had been taught about the age of human civilization was wrong. But he didn't tell anyone. Not then. He wrote in his notebook, made his sketches, took his measurements, and at night, when the others were asleep, he would hold that stone and feel the weight of something he couldn't name. This is not a story about what was found in the Gobi Desert. This is a story about what one man saw on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1924, and why he chose to stay silent. It's about the 3 seconds between seeing something impossible and deciding whether to speak. About the gap between evidence and belief, and how that gap can swallow entire truths before they ever reach daylight. Because sometimes the most important discoveries in human history are not the ones we celebrate. They're the ones we almost made, the ones that slipped through our fingers because we couldn't quite bring ourselves to believe what we were seeing. Grachev saw something. He documented it. And then he buried it in a notebook that would sit unopened for 90 years. Let's go back to that afternoon. The sun in the Gobi in April is not gentle. It doesn't warm you gradually. It simply exists, a constant pressure against your skin, against your thoughts. Grachev had been walking for 3 hours, moving away from the main camp, following a dry riverbed that cut through layers of sedimentary rock like a knife through old bread. He wasn't supposed to be there alone. The expedition leader had been clear about that. But Grachev had seen something from a distance the day before, a formation that didn't quite fit. And the kind of curiosity that makes a good geologist is the same kind that makes a person walk into places they shouldn't go. The riverbed was perhaps 20 meters wide, its walls rising on either side in striated bands of red and ochre and pale gray. These were old rocks, millions of years old, the kind of geological time that makes human history feel like a breath, like nothing at all. Grachev knew this. He had studied it. He understood that the layer he was walking through had been laid down in an ancient sea, long before the first hominids stood upright, long before consciousness itself had emerged on this planet. But there, embedded in the eastern wall of the riverbed, about 2 meters above the current floor level, was something that violated everything he understood about geological time. It was a stone, dark gray, almost black, roughly spherical but not quite. About the size of a fist, as I said. And it was clearly worked. Not by water, not by wind, not by the random forces of erosion that can sometimes, through pure chance, create shapes that look almost intentional. This was different. The surface was covered in deliberate markings, shallow grooves that formed patterns, geometric arrangements that suggested measurement, organization, thought. Grachev stopped walking. He could hear his own breathing, loud in the silence of the desert. His shadow fell across the wall in front of him, and for a moment he didn't move at all, just stood there with his hand raised to shield his eyes from the sun, looking at this object that shouldn't exist in this place, in this layer of rock. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in scientific method and geological principles, immediately began constructing explanations. Must be modern. Someone must have placed it there recently, and the surrounding sediment had collapsed around it, creating the illusion that it was embedded in ancient rock. Or perhaps it had fallen from above, from a higher, newer layer, and somehow become wedged in a crack. These things happen. The earth moves, rock falls, objects end up in places that seem impossible until you understand the mechanism. But Grachev was a good geologist. Better than good. He understood stratigraphy, understood how to read the layers of time pressed into stone. And as he approached the wall, as he ran his fingers over the rocks surrounding the object, he could feel that it wasn't displaced. It wasn't out of context. The sedimentary layers flowed around it naturally, continuously. The stone was part of the formation. It had been here when this layer was laid down, which meant it had been here for millions of years, which was impossible. The sun in the Gobi in April is not gentle. It doesn't warm you gradually. It simply exists, a constant pressure against your skin, against your thoughts. Grachev had been walking for 3 hours, moving away from the main camp, following a dry riverbed that cut through layers of sedimentary rock like a knife through old bread. He wasn't supposed to be there alone. The expedition leader had been clear about that. But Grachev had seen something from a distance the day before, a formation that didn't quite fit. And the kind of curiosity that makes a good geologist is the same kind that makes a person walk into places they shouldn't go. The riverbed was perhaps 20 meters wide, its walls rising on either side in striated bands of red and ochre and pale gray. These were old rocks, millions of years old, the kind of geological time that makes human history feel like a breath, like nothing at all. Grachev knew this. He had studied it. He understood that the layer he was walking through had been laid down in an ancient sea, long before the first hominids stood upright, long before consciousness itself had emerged on this planet. But there, embedded in the eastern wall of the riverbed, about 2 meters above the current floor level, was something that violated everything he understood about geological time. It was a stone. Dark gray, almost black, roughly spherical but not quite. About the size of a fist, as I said. And it was clearly worked. Not by water. Not by wind. Not by the random forces of erosion that can sometimes, through pure chance, create shapes that look almost intentional. This was different. The surface was covered in deliberate markings. Shallow grooves that formed patterns, geometric arrangements that suggested measurement, organization, thought. Grachev stopped walking. He could hear his own breathing, loud in the silence of the desert. His shadow fell across the wall in front of him, and for a moment he didn't move at all, just stood there with his hand raised to shield his eyes from the sun, looking at this object that shouldn't exist in this place, in this layer of rock. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in scientific method and geological principles, immediately began constructing explanations. Must be modern. Someone must have placed it there recently, and the surrounding sediment had collapsed around it, creating the illusion that it was embedded in ancient rock. Or perhaps it had fallen from above, from a higher, newer layer, and somehow become wedged in a crack. These things happen. The earth moves, rock falls, objects end up in places that seem impossible until you understand the mechanism. But Grachev was a good geologist. Better than good. He understood stratigraphy, understood how to read the layers of time pressed into stone. And as he approached the wall, as he ran his fingers over the rocks surrounding the object, he could feel that it wasn't displaced. It wasn't out of context. The sedimentary layers flowed around it naturally, continuously. The stone was part of the formation. It had been here when this layer was laid down, which meant it had been here for millions of years, which was impossible. He worked it free carefully, using his knife to chip away at the surrounding matrix. Took him almost an hour. His hands were shaking slightly, though he couldn't have said whether it was from excitement or something else, something deeper and less comfortable. When the stone finally came loose, he held it in his palm and felt its weight. It was heavier than it looked, denser than the surrounding sandstone. The markings on its surface caught the light, creating tiny shadows that made the patterns seem to shift and move. Grachev sat down in the sand. He had water in his canteen, and he poured a small amount over the stone, washing away the dust and debris. The patterns became clearer, not writing exactly, or if it was writing, it followed no alphabet he recognized. But there was clear intentionality in the arrangement. Parallel lines intersected by shorter perpendicular marks. Clusters of small circular indentations arranged in groups of 5 and 7. A spiral that wound inward toward a central point. He opened his notebook. He made his sketch. He recorded the exact location, the depth within the formation, the composition of the surrounding matrix. He wrote down his observations in careful, methodical language, the language of science, of documentation. And then, at the bottom of the page, he allowed himself those 3 words. Context makes no sense. 'Cause it didn't. If the stone was as old as its position in the rock suggested, then it predated human beings by millions of years. Predated primates. It predated most of mammalian evolution, which meant either his reading of the geology was catastrophically wrong, which he knew it wasn't, or something else was going on, something that didn't fit into any framework he had been given for understanding the world. Think about that for a moment. Think about being 26 years old, sitting alone in a desert, holding in your hand something that suggests everything you've been taught is incomplete. Not wrong exactly, but missing something fundamental. You're not a famous scientist. You're not the expedition leader. You're a junior member of a team that's already struggling for funding, already fighting to be taken seriously by the academic establishment back home. You have no credentials to make a claim this large, no authority, and you're holding a rock that, if you're reading it correctly, shouldn't exist. What do? Grachev put the stone in his pocket. He finished his water. He walked back to camp as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, turning the whole desert the color of dried blood. That night, he didn't mention what he'd found. The others asked where he'd been, why he'd gone off alone, and he said he'd been following a formation, taking measurements, the usual work, which was true as far as it went. He ate his dinner, canned meat and hard bread, and he listened to the others talk about their own findings, the fossilized remains of ancient mammals, the evidence of prehistoric lakes and rivers, the slow rewinding of deep time that their work was revealing. And he said nothing. In his tent that night, by the light of a small oil lamp, he held the stone again, turned it over in his hands, traced the patterns with his finger. He thought about showing it to Sokolov, the expedition leader, a man 20 years his senior with a reputation for rigor and skepticism. But he knew what would happen. Sokolov would look at the stone, listen to Grachev's description of where it was found, and then he would construct the same rational explanations Grachev had already considered and discarded. Modern intrusion, displacement, contamination. Because those explanations, however unlikely, were still more believable than the alternative. And if Grachev insisted, if he pushed back against those explanations, presented his evidence, demanded that the find be taken seriously, at best, he would be seen as overeager, inexperienced, unable to distinguish between genuinely anomalous data and his own wishful thinking. At worst, he would damage his credibility permanently, mark himself as unreliable, the kind of scientist who sees what he wants to see rather than what's actually there. So he made a decision. He would wait. He would gather more evidence. He would return to that riverbed, excavate more carefully, document everything with such thoroughness that when he finally did present his findings, there would be no room for doubt. He would build a case so airtight that even Sokolov would have to acknowledge what he'd found. But here's what Grachev didn't know, couldn't have known. He would never get that chance. 3 weeks later, the expedition's funding was cut. Political circumstances back in Moscow had shifted. Resources were being redirected. The team was ordered to wrap up their work and return home immediately. There was no time for new excavations, no opportunity for Grachev to go back to that riverbed and collect the additional evidence he needed. They packed their equipment, their specimens, their notes, and they left the Gobi Desert on a morning in early May, traveling by truck and then by train across thousands of kilometers of steppe and mountain, back to a country that was itself in the process of transformation, where scientific priorities were being rewritten along with everything else. Grachev kept the stone. He kept his notebook. And he kept his silence. For the next 6 years, he worked as a geologist for various government surveys. He married. He had a daughter. He published papers on mineral deposits and sedimentary formations, competent work that earned him a modest reputation but nothing more. The stone stayed wrapped in cloth in a wooden box in his study. Sometimes late at night he would take it out and look at it, turn it over in his hands the way he had that first night in the desert. He thought about writing a paper, presenting his findings, finally sharing what he'd discovered. But by then it was 1930, and the Soviet Union was not a place where unusual claims were welcomed, especially not claims that might challenge official narratives about history and human progress. And besides, he had no context now. No expedition report to reference. No supporting team to corroborate his methodology. Just a stone and a notebook and a story that sounded, even to him, increasingly unlikely. He died in 1952, during the winter of pneumonia. He was 54 years old. His daughter, sorting through his belongings, found the stone in its box. She found the notebook too, though she didn't read it carefully, didn't understand what the sketches and measurements might mean. They were academic materials, her father's work, and she donated them to a museum along with his other papers and specimens, thinking that perhaps someone someday might find them useful for historical research. The stone itself she kept for a while. It sat on a shelf in her apartment, a curiosity, a memento. But eventually, during one of her moves, it was lost, misplaced in a box that went to storage and was never retrieved. Or perhaps she gave it away, passed it on to someone who saw it as nothing more than an interesting rock, a decorative object. We don't know. It's gone now. Lost to time in the same way that its significance was lost, buried under layers of silence and missed opportunities. But the notebook survived. And in 2014, a researcher named Elena Volkov, working on a project about early Soviet scientific expeditions, found it in that museum basement in Ulaanbaatar. She was looking for something else entirely. Documentation of paleontological discoveries from the 1920s, and she almost didn't open Grachev's notebook at all. It wasn't what she needed. But she was thorough and she had time, and so she paged through it, looking at sketches of rock formations and fossil fragments, reading brief notes about weather conditions and equipment problems. And then she turned to page 47. She stopped. She read the description. She looked at the sketch. And she felt something shift in her understanding, a small tremor of recognition that something significant had been documented here. Something that had then been buried not by earth or time but by simple human silence, by fear and circumstance and the terrible fragility of knowledge that exists in only one person's mind. Volkov spent the next year trying to reconstruct what Grachev had found. She analyzed his description of the location, used modern satellite imagery to identify possible sites in the Gobi that matched his geological notes. She reached out to colleagues, experts in both geology and archaeology, showing them Grachev's sketch, asking whether they had ever seen anything similar. The responses were mixed. Some suggested the markings could be natural after all, that human pattern recognition is powerful enough to find intentionality in randomness. Others were more intrigued but cautious, pointing out that without the actual artifact, without the ability to conduct modern dating techniques or compositional analysis, any conclusions would be speculative at best. She published a paper in 2016 in a relatively obscure journal focused on the history of Soviet science. The paper was careful, measured. It presented Grachev's findings as they were documented, raised questions about what might have been discovered and subsequently lost, and called for renewed investigation of the sites he had described. The paper was read by perhaps 300 people, generated no headlines. No follow-up expeditions were funded. The desert keeps its secrets, and the window that had briefly opened in 1924, when one man held an impossible stone in his hand and made a choice, remained closed. Pause for a moment. Think about how many times this might have happened. How many observers across how many centuries might have encountered evidence that challenged prevailing understanding, but chose silence over speaking, chose safety over truth. Not because they were cowards, but because they understood the cost of being wrong, the price of claiming to know something that others would find absurd. The history of human knowledge is not just the history of discoveries made and shared. It's also the history of discoveries made and buried, of evidence gathered and then lost, of truths that flickered briefly into view and then vanished again, leaving only the faintest trace, a sketch in a notebook, a note in a margin, a story told once and never repeated. We think of scientific progress as cumulative, as building steadily upward, each generation standing on the shoulders of the last. But that metaphor assumes that everything found is preserved, that all evidence is shared, that knowledge, once gained, is never lost. The reality is messier. Knowledge is fragile. It depends on individuals having the courage to speak, on institutions being willing to listen, on the right circumstances aligning at the right moment. Miss that moment, and the knowledge doesn't just pause, it disappears. It has to be rediscovered, often centuries later, often by accident. The Gobi Desert is vast. More than 1.3 million square kilometers of sand and rock and wind, stretching across southern Mongolia and northern China. It's one of the least hospitable environments on Earth, a place where temperatures can swing 50 degrees between day and night, where water is scarce and human presence is minimal. It's also one of the richest paleontological sites in the world, a place where the fossils of ancient creatures emerge from eroding rock faces with every sandstorm, where entire chapters of evolutionary history lie exposed to anyone who knows how to read them. But it's also a place of gaps. The geological record is never complete. There are always missing pieces, layers that have eroded away, time periods that left no trace. And in those gaps, in those absences, There's room for questions that can't be easily answered, for possibilities that can't be easily dismissed. What if Grachev's stone was real? What if the markings on it were indeed intentional, the product of some form of intelligence operating in a time and place where, according to everything we know, no such intelligence should have existed? There are few ways to think about this. The first and most obvious is that Grachev was simply wrong. His reading of the geology was mistaken, or the stone was modern and somehow became embedded in older rock through some mechanism he didn't recognize. This is the safe interpretation, the one that requires the least adjustment to our existing frameworks. It's probably the correct one. But let's sit with the alternative for a moment. Not because we're going to abandon scientific rigor, not because we're going to embrace wild speculation, but because sometimes it's worth examining the edges of what we know, the places where our certainty begins to fray. If the stone was as old as its geological context suggested, then we have to explain how something with intentional markings ended up in rock that predates human evolution by millions of years. The options are limited. Either some form of intelligence existed on Earth far earlier than we believe, or the stone came from somewhere else, or our understanding of geological processes is incomplete in ways we haven't yet recognized, or Grachev's documentation was flawed. Each of these possibilities has problems. The first two require us to overturn fundamental aspects of what we know about the history of life on this planet, and the absence of evidence for extraterrestrial visitors. The third is always possible. Science is never finished, and there are certainly gaps in our understanding, but it would need to be a very specific gap, one that could explain how modern objects become embedded in ancient stone in a way that's indistinguishable from natural inclusion. The fourth brings us back to human error, which is always the most likely explanation when dealing with anomalous claims. But here's what's interesting. We can't actually resolve this question. Not now. Because the stone is lost. The site was never properly excavated. Grachev's findings were never verified by others. We have only his notebook, his sketch, his notes. And that's not enough. It will never be enough. So we're left in a peculiar position. We have documentation of something that, if accurate, would be profoundly important. But we can't verify it. We can't test it. We can't subject it to the processes that would allow us to determine whether it was genuine or mistaken. It exists in a kind of epistemic limbo, neither confirmed nor definitively refuted, just suspended. A possibility that can't be fully explored because the key piece of evidence no longer exists. And this, perhaps, is the real story. Not whether the stone was what Grachev thought it was, but what happens to knowledge when it depends on objects that can be lost, on documentation that can be ignored, on individuals who choose silence over speech. Think about Grachev in his tent that night, holding the stone, making his decision. He was not thinking about future historians or researchers who might one day find his notebook. He was thinking about his career, his credibility, his immediate circumstances. He made a reasonable choice given what he knew at the time. Gather more evidence. Build a stronger case. Don't overreach. Don't claim more than you can prove. But in waiting, he lost his chance. And in losing his chance, we lost. What? We don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe he was wrong, and if he had spoken up, the stone would have been examined and revealed to be a modern intrusion after all, and that would have been the end of it. Or maybe he was right, and what he held in his hand that night was evidence of something that would have fundamentally changed our understanding of the past, and by staying silent, he ensured that understanding would remain incomplete. The tragedy is not knowing which of these is true. There's a broader pattern here that's worth examining. The history of archaeology and paleontology is filled with moments like this, with discoveries that were almost made, with evidence that was almost recognized. For every Lucy, the famous Australopithecus fossil that reshaped our understanding of human evolution, there are probably dozens of fragments that were found and lost, bones that eroded away before they could be documented, sites that were destroyed by construction or erosion or simple bad luck before anyone realized what they contained. The fossil record is incomplete not just because fossilization is rare, but because preservation is rare, and discovery is rare, and recognition is rare. You need all of these things to align. A creature has to die in exactly the right place, under exactly the right conditions, for its remains to be preserved. Those remains have to survive millions of years of geological activity without being destroyed. Someone has to find them. And whoever finds them has to recognize what they've found, has to understand its significance, has to have the resources and knowledge to document it properly. Miss any one of these steps, and the evidence disappears. The creature might as well have never existed, at least as far as our scientific record is concerned. Now think about how much more tenuous this process becomes when we're talking about evidence of intelligence rather than just biological remains. Bone is a bone, has diagnostic features that can be measured and compared. But a tool, a marking, an artifact, these require interpretation. You have to decide whether something was made or just happened, whether a pattern is intentional or accidental, whether an object is in its original context or has been moved. These are judgment calls. They require expertise, yes, but they also require a certain willingness to see, to consider possibilities that might seem unlikely. And that willingness is not evenly distributed. Some researchers are more open to anomalous findings than others. Some are more cautious, more skeptical, more concerned about protecting their credibility. Neither approach is wrong exactly. Both are necessary. Science needs both the people who see patterns everywhere and the people who are slow to accept new patterns, because between these two poles, through argument and evidence and testing, we arrive at something closer to truth. But it means that in any given moment, whether a piece of evidence is recognized and preserved or overlooked and lost can depend on who happens to find it, on what framework they bring to the interpretation, on whether they're willing to risk their reputation by making a claim that others might find incredible. Grachev was cautious. He wanted more evidence. And because of that caution, because of that very reasonable, very scientific desire to build a stronger case before speaking, we lost the chance to evaluate what he'd found. Let that settle. There's something else worth considering. The Gobi Desert in the early 20th century was not easily accessible. Getting there required months of travel, significant resources, and tolerance for extreme hardship. The 1924 expedition that Grachev was part of was one of only a handful of scientific ventures into that region during that period. The next major expedition wouldn't come for years, and even then, it would focus on different areas, different geological formations. Which means that the specific riverbed where Grachev found his stone might have remained largely unexamined for decades. And in that time, the desert does what deserts do. Wind erodes, and shift. Rock faces that were exposed in 1924 might have been buried by 1950, or collapsed, or scoured away to nothing. Even if someone had wanted to go back and verify Grachev's findings, even if his notebook had been discovered earlier and taken seriously, there's no guarantee the site would have still been accessible, still been intact. The desert does not preserve human intentions. It preserves only what it chooses to preserve, and on timescales that make human purposes irrelevant. So we have layers of loss here. First, the loss of the stone itself, misplaced or discarded after Grachev's death. Second, the loss of the opportunity to excavate the site while it was still accessible. Third, the loss of Grachev's living testimony. His ability to lead someone back to the exact location, to explain in detail what he saw and how he interpreted it. And fourth, perhaps most fundamentally, the loss of the context itself, the geological formation that, even if it still exists somewhere in the Gobi, is now anonymous, indistinguishable from thousands of other eroded riverbanks cutting through ancient stone. Each of these losses compounds the others. Together, they create a gap in knowledge that cannot be bridged, not with the information we currently have, possibly not ever. And yet the notebook remains. Grachev's sketch remains. His measurements, his notes, his 3 underlined words. Context makes no sense. These things exist. They are not nothing. They are documentation of an observation, made by a trained scientist, recorded in careful detail. They may not be enough to prove anything, but they're enough to suggest that something happened in the Gobi Desert in April of 1924, something that at least one competent observer found significant enough to document and troubling enough to keep quiet about. What do we do with that? How do we incorporate it into our understanding of the past? The honest answer is, we can't really. Not in any definitive way. We can note it. We can include it in historical accounts of early expeditions to the Gobi. We can use it as an example of how evidence can be lost, how knowledge can be fragile. But we can't build theories on it. We can't use it to challenge established frameworks about the age of human civilization or the timeline of intelligence on Earth. It's just not solid enough for that. It's a suggestion, a hint, a question mark in the margin of history. But maybe that's not nothing. Maybe the value of Grachev's notebook is not in what it proves, but in what it reminds us of. That our picture of the past is assembled from fragments, that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, that there are probably many things we don't know about human history and prehistory, not because the evidence never existed, but because it existed briefly and then was lost before anyone could properly examine it. The Gobi Desert has been there for millions of years. Humans have been seriously exploring it for less than 2 centuries. In that time we found remarkable things: dinosaur eggs, early mammal fossils, evidence of ancient climates and ecosystems. But we've explored perhaps a tiny fraction of what's there. Most of it remains unmapped, unexcavated, unknown. And every year, erosion reveals new things and destroys others. Every sandstorm is both archaeologist and vandal, exposing what was hidden and hiding what was exposed. Somewhere in that vastness, there might be other stones like the one Grachev found. Or there might not. We don't know. We can't know without looking. And looking would require resources and time, and a willingness to take seriously the possibility that something significant might be found in an unexpected context. But here's the difficulty. Resources are limited. Scientific funding is competitive. Researchers have to make choices about where to direct their attention, and those choices are inevitably influenced by what seems most likely to yield results, what fits best with existing frameworks, what can be justified to funding agencies and peer reviewers. A search for anomalous artifacts in the Gobi Desert, based on 90-year-old notes from a junior geologist who never published his findings and whose key evidence is lost, that's not a proposal that's likely to succeed. It's too speculative, too uncertain, too likely to be a waste of time and money, which is completely reasonable. This is how science has to work. You pursue the most promising leads. You build on what's already established. You don't chase every anomalous claim, especially when the evidence is thin and the stakes are unclear. But it means that some questions remain unasked. Some possibilities remain unexplored. Not because they're definitively answered, but because they fall below the threshold of what seems worth investigating given limited resources and infinite possible questions. And so Grachev's stone joins a long list of might-have-beens, of things that could have changed our understanding if only the circumstances had been slightly different, if only one or two small variables had aligned differently. It's not alone in this. History is full of such moments. The Library of Alexandria burning. The first European explorers to the Americas carrying diseases that would devastate populations and destroy knowledge systems before they could be documented. Manuscripts lost in wars. Artifacts destroyed by looting or simple neglect. Over and over we see the same pattern. Knowledge created, briefly preserved, then lost before it can be transmitted forward. We live, always, with the consequences of these losses. Our understanding of the past is shaped not just by what survived but by what didn't, by the gaps and absences that we often don't even recognize as gaps because we don't know what's missing. Pause here. Think about what you know about human history. Where does that knowledge come from? Mostly from things that survived. Texts, artifacts, structures. But what about the things that didn't survive? The oral traditions that were never written down. The wooden structures that rotted away. The textiles that degraded. The tools that were so common no one thought to preserve them. The knowledge held by individuals who died without passing it on. Every civilization, every culture, every human community has produced vastly more knowledge than it has preserved. The preservation is always selective, often accidental, sometimes deliberate but with criteria that seem arbitrary in retrospect. We preserve what we think is important, but our assessment of importance is shaped by our present concerns, our current understanding. And so we lose things that might have seemed unimportant at the time but which, from a future perspective, might have been crucial. Grachev thought he had time. He thought he would be able to return, gather more evidence, build his case properly. He was thinking like a scientist, which is to say he was thinking about verification and reproducibility and peer review. All good things. All necessary things. But he wasn't thinking about the fragility of opportunity, about how quickly a moment can close and never reopen. And so he waited. And in waiting, he ensured that his discovery, if it was a discovery, would remain forever unverified, forever in the realm of the uncertain and the lost. There's a certain sadness to this that's hard to articulate. Not grief exactly. Nothing died here except a possibility, and possibilities die all the time. But there's a sense of waste, of potential unrealized, of a door that briefly opened and then closed before anyone could walk through it. We'll never know what Grachev really found. We'll never know if his interpretation was correct, or if he was mistaken about the geological context, or if the stone was something else entirely that he didn't recognize. We'll never know if there are more stones like it still out there in the desert, waiting to be found, or if his was unique, a singular anomaly that chance brought to his hand for a brief moment before scattering it again into oblivion. What we do know is that one man, in the spring of 1924, saw something that troubled him enough to document it carefully, and then hide that documentation away because he didn't know how to make others see what he had seen. And that dynamic, the gap between seeing and being believed, between evidence and acceptance, that's a dynamic that has shaped human knowledge throughout our history. Science prides itself on objectivity, on following the evidence wherever it leads. And in ideal conditions, that's how it works. But conditions are rarely ideal. Evidence is always interpreted through frameworks, and frameworks are resistant to change, appropriately so. They have to be. If every anomalous finding caused us to overturn everything we thought we knew, we would never build stable knowledge. We would be constantly starting over, constantly uncertain. So we require strong evidence for strong claims. We require reproducibility. We require peer review and verification. These are good standards. They protect us from error, from wishful thinking, from the countless ways human perception and cognition can mislead us. But they also mean that evidence which can't be reproduced, findings that exist in isolation, observations made by individuals who lack the authority or resources to pursue them properly, these things fall through the cracks. They exist in a kind of epistemic purgatory, neither accepted nor definitively rejected, just ignored, set aside, forgotten. And maybe that's fine. Maybe most such findings are indeed errors, misinterpretations, wishful thinking. Maybe the filter is working as it should, keeping out the noise so the signal can be heard clearly. But occasionally, probably more often than we'd like to admit, something real gets filtered out too. Something that, if it had been recognized and preserved and investigated properly, might have taught us something important, might have opened a new line of inquiry, might have adjusted our understanding in ways that would cascade forward, changing how we see other things, other patterns, other possibilities. We'll never know how often this happens. By definition, we can't know. Because if something is lost before it can be verified, it leaves no trace except perhaps a note in a forgotten notebook, a sketch on a yellowed page, a story told once and never repeated. The Gobi Desert is still there. It's still eroding, still revealing and concealing according to the rhythms of wind and time. Researchers still go there, still find remarkable things. Just recently, within the last few decades, new discoveries have emerged. Evidence of ancient human presence earlier than previously thought, stone tools in unexpected locations, signs of cultural complexity in time periods we once assumed were simple. Each of these discoveries adjusts our picture slightly, fills in a gap, adds a piece to the puzzle. But the puzzle is enormous, and the pieces are scattered across millions of years and millions of square kilometers. And most of them are gone now, eroded to dust or buried so deep they'll never be found. We work with what we have. We build our understanding from the fragments that survived, and we try to be honest about the limitations of that understanding, about how much we don't know, how much we can't know, how much has been permanently lost. And sometimes, when we find a notebook in a basement, when we read a description of something that was seen once and then lost, we pause. We consider. We note the possibility. And then we move on because there's nothing else we can do. The stone is gone. The site is gone. The witness is dead. All that remains is a question, hanging in the air, unanswerable. Does the Gobi Desert hide traces of the first civilization? The conventional answer is no. The evidence suggests that human civilization, as we define it, cities, agriculture, writing, complex social organization, began in places like Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, in the relatively recent past, within the last 10 or 15,000 years. The Gobi was inhabited by various human groups throughout prehistory, but there's no evidence of anything we would call civilization there before that time frame. But that's the answer we give based on what has been found and verified. What about what hasn't been found? What about what was found and then lost? What about Grachev's stone, sitting for a moment in human hands before slipping away again into the anonymity of time? If we're being rigorous, we have to say, we don't know. We don't know what might be out there, still buried, still waiting. We don't know what might have been found and lost before proper documentation. We don't know the full extent of what the desert has erased. And that uncertainty, that acknowledgement of limitation, is not a weakness. It's honesty. It's recognizing that our knowledge is contingent, provisional, assembled from incomplete data. It's understanding that the map is not the territory, that what we know about the past is not the same as what actually happened, and the gap between these two things is large and mostly invisible. We tell ourselves stories about the past, stories built from evidence and inference and educated guessing. And these stories are useful. They help us make sense of where we came from, how we got here, what it means to be human. But they're still stories, shaped by what survived to be found and what we were able to recognize and interpret correctly. Other stories are possible, not equally likely, not equally supported by evidence, but possible. Grachev's stone, if it was what he thought it was, would have implied a different story, a stranger story, one with implications we can barely imagine. But we'll never know if that story was true. We only know that for a brief moment, one person believed it might be, and then chose silence, and then died, and the possibility died with him, leaving only a sketch in a notebook and a note that says, "Context makes no sense." Maybe it didn't. Maybe the context was impossible, and Grachev was wrong to think the stone was as old as the rock that held it. Maybe there was some mechanism he didn't understand, some way for modern objects to become embedded in ancient stone that looks like natural inclusion but isn't. Or maybe the context really didn't make sense. Maybe there are things about the past that don't fit into our frameworks, that challenge our assumptions, that suggest the story is more complicated than we think. Both possibilities remain open. Neither can be closed. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps what Grachev's notebook teaches us is not any specific fact about the Gobi Desert or human prehistory, but something about the nature of knowledge itself. How it depends on fragile chains of preservation and transmission, how easily it can be broken, how much of the past is simply gone and unknowable, no matter how much we wish it weren't. We are, all of us, standing on a platform of knowledge that's narrower than we typically imagine, surrounded by an ocean of uncertainty that we've mostly stopped noticing because it's easier to focus on what we do know than to contemplate the vastness of what we don't. But every once in a while, something reminds us. A notebook found in a basement. A sketch of a stone that no longer exists. 3 words underlined twice. Context makes no sense. And we remember that the past is not a settled thing, not a completed puzzle, but an ongoing mystery, most of which will remain forever unsolved, not because the answers don't exist, but because the evidence disappeared before we could examine it, before we could ask the right questions, before we even knew there was something to wonder about. The Gobi Desert keeps its secrets, not deliberately, not maliciously, simply because it's vast and old and indifferent to human curiosity, and because the wind doesn't care about preserving evidence for future generations, and because time is patient and thorough in its work of erasure. Somewhere in that vastness, perhaps in a riverbed whose walls have long since collapsed, there might have been something that would have changed everything we think we know. Or perhaps not. Perhaps Grachev was mistaken, and the stone was modern after all, and the mystery is just an illusion created by incomplete documentation and the natural human tendency to see patterns where none exist. We can't know which of these is true. We can only acknowledge both possibilities, hold them in tension, and accept that some questions have no answers, not because the answers are hidden, but because the evidence needed to resolve them no longer exists and perhaps never existed in sufficient quantity to be conclusive. This is the condition of our knowledge about the past. Always incomplete, always provisional, always shadowed by the awareness that what we don't know might be vastly larger than what we do know. And most of what we don't know we will never even recognize as a gap because we have no way to see what's missing. Grachev saw something. He documented it. He made a choice. And that choice, reasonable as it was, ensured that his observation would remain forever in the realm of the unverified and the lost. Not because he did anything wrong, but because the circumstances that would have allowed verification never aligned. and by the time anyone else found his notes, it was too late. The stone was gone. The site was inaccessible or destroyed. The moment had passed. How many other moments like this have there been? How many observations made and then lost? How many pieces of evidence that briefly surfaced and then sank again before anyone could properly examine them? We don't know. We can't know. But the existence of Grachev's notebook suggests it's more than zero, perhaps many more than zero. Suggests that the fossil record of human knowledge is even more incomplete than the fossil record of biological life. And that's saying something. And so we build our understanding on the fragments we have, knowing they're fragments, knowing they're incomplete, trying to be humble about the limits of what we can claim to know with certainty. The desert doesn't care. It continues its slow work, revealing and erasing, creating and destroying, indifferent to our questions and our need for answers. It was there before us. It will be there after us. And in between, we get this brief moment to look, to search, to try to understand what came before and what it might mean. Mostly, we find what we expect to find. Evidence that confirms our existing frameworks, that fits into the stories we've already told ourselves about how the world works and how the past unfolded. This is natural. This is how pattern recognition works. We see what we're prepared to see. But occasionally, someone sees something else, something that doesn't fit, and they have to decide what to do with that observation. Speak or stay silent, push forward or pull back, risk credibility or play it safe. Grachev chose safety, chose to wait, chose to be careful and rigorous and methodical, all good scientific virtues. And in doing so, he ensured that his finding, whatever it was, would be lost. Was he wrong to make that choice? It's hard to say. Without more evidence, without the stone itself, without the ability to examine the site, even if he had spoken up, even if he had published his findings immediately, what would have changed? Probably nothing. Probably his claims would have been dismissed as insufficiently supported, as premature, as the overenthusiasm of a young researcher seeing what he wanted to see. So maybe his silence didn't matter. Maybe speaking wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe the result would have been the same either way. The stone lost, the site inaccessible, the finding unverified and eventually forgotten. Or maybe, if he had spoken, if he had published, if he had made his case however imperfect, someone else might have taken interest. Someone with more resources or more credibility might have organized a follow-up expedition, might have returned to the Gobi while the site was still accessible, might have found additional evidence that would have confirmed or refuted Grachev's interpretation. We can't know. The timeline where Grachev spoke up is not the timeline we live in. In our timeline, he stayed silent, and the knowledge died with him. And all we have is a notebook and a question that can never be answered. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the Gobi Desert, if it does hide traces of something unexpected, something that challenges our understanding of the human past, is content to keep those traces hidden a while longer. Time enough for the wind to erase them completely, or time enough for someone else to find them and this time to speak. Until then, we have Grachev's sketch. We have his measurements. We have 3 words underlined twice in a notebook that almost no one has ever read. Context makes no sense. And we have the desert itself, vast and ancient and indifferent, holding whatever it holds, revealing what it chooses to reveal, on a timescale that makes human urgency irrelevant. Somewhere between the documented and the lost, between the known and the unknowable, Grachev's stone exists in memory only, a possibility that can neither be confirmed nor entirely dismissed, a reminder that the past is not what we found but what actually happened, and the gap between these two things is vast and mostly dark. We do our best. We search. We document. We preserve what we can. But we're small and time is large, and the forces of erasure are patient and thorough. Most of what has ever existed is gone now. Most of what has ever been known is forgotten. We work with what remains, and we try not to think too much about everything that's been lost, because if we did, the weight of that absence would be crushing. Better to focus on what we have. Better to celebrate the finds rather than mourn the losses. Better to build understanding from available evidence rather than speculate about evidence that might have existed but doesn't anymore. Yet, there's value sometimes in acknowledging what we don't know, in recognizing the limits of our certainty, in admitting that the past might have been stranger than the stories we tell about it, that human history might contain chapters we've never read because the pages have turned to dust or were torn out before the book was assembled. The Gobi Desert might hide traces of something unexpected, or it might not. We don't know. We're probably never going to know, not with certainty. And that's okay. Not every question has to be answered. Not every mystery has to be solved. But it's worth remembering that the questions exist. Worth remembering Grachev sitting in his tent in the spring of 1924, holding a stone that confused him, that challenged his understanding, that made him question whether the framework he'd been given for interpreting the world was complete. He chose not to speak. And because of that choice, we don't know what he really found. We only know that he found something and it troubled him, and he documented it carefully. And then he stayed quiet, and the moment passed, and the evidence was lost, and here we are 90 years later, looking at a sketch in a notebook and wondering what might have been. That wondering is all we have. That and the knowledge that the desert is still there, still holding whatever it holds, still waiting for someone to ask the right questions, to look in the right places, to see what's there to be seen, and then to have the courage or the resources or the good fortune to bring that seeing into the light where others can examine it and test it and verify it or refute it. Until then, Grachev's stone remains a question mark, possibility, a suggestion that maybe, just maybe, there's more to the story than we know. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just an error, a misinterpretation, a cautionary tale about the need for verification and the dangers of premature conclusions. Both readings are possible. Neither can be proven. And so we hold them both lightly, aware that certainty is a luxury we don't always get, especially when dealing with evidence that existed briefly and then disappeared, leaving only a trace in a notebook that almost no one has ever read. The past is not what we think it is. It's what it was, and most of what it was is gone now, beyond recovery, beyond knowing. We have fragments. We have hints. We have enough to build stories that are probably close to true, probably good enough for most purposes. But probably is not the same as certainly. And good enough is not the same as complete. And sometimes late at night, when you're reading old expedition notes or looking at sketches in forgotten notebooks, you encounter something that reminds you of the gap between what we know and what actually happened, and you pause and you wonder, and you acknowledge that the map is not the territory, and the territory is vast and mostly unmapped, and we're doing our best with limited tools and limited time and limited evidence. And maybe that's all we can do. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the acknowledgement of limitation is itself a kind of knowledge, a kind of wisdom, a recognition that we're small and the universe is large and most of what has ever existed is beyond our reach now, dispersed into entropy, eroded by time, lost to the same forces that will eventually claim everything we know and everything we are. But for now we're here. We can still search. We can still find things. We can still document and preserve and try to understand. And occasionally we can still be surprised, still encounter something that doesn't fit, that challenges our frameworks, that suggests the story might be bigger and stranger than we thought. And when we do, we have to decide what to do with that encounter. How seriously to take it. Whether to speak or stay silent. Whether to risk credibility by pursuing something uncertain or to play it safe by focusing on what's already established. These are not easy decisions. They require judgment, courage, resources, luck. And sometimes, even when we make the right choice, circumstances conspire against us, and the evidence is lost anyway, and we're left with only questions and the knowledge that we tried but it wasn't enough. Grachev tried. He documented. He preserved what he could. It wasn't enough. The stone was lost. The site became inaccessible. The moment passed. But the trying matters. The documentation matters. Because 90 years later, someone found his notebook, read his notes, considered his sketch, and asked whether there might be something to this, whether it might be worth investigating, whether the Gobi Desert might indeed hide traces of something we haven't yet recognized. The answer to that question is still open, still uncertain, still waiting for someone with the resources and the interest and the good fortune to pursue it properly. Maybe someday someone will. Maybe someday there will be another expedition to the Gobi, another researcher walking along an eroded riverbed, another moment of recognition when something that doesn't fit catches the eye and demands attention. And maybe, this time, the circumstances will align differently. The evidence will be preserved. The site will be documented. The finding will be verified or refuted. And we'll have an answer, one way or another. Or maybe not. Maybe the desert has already erased whatever was there. Maybe the evidence, if it existed, is gone now, scattered to dust. And we'll never know what Grachev really saw or whether his interpretation was correct. Either way, the question remains. A small question in the grand scheme of things. One man's observation, one stone, one afternoon in the Gobi Desert in the spring of 1924. Not the kind of thing that changes the world, probably. Not the kind of thing that most people would even notice or care about. But to Grachev in that moment it mattered. It mattered enough to document carefully, to think about deeply, to carry with him for the rest of his life. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the significance of a thing is not determined by whether it changes the world, but by whether it changes the person who encounters it, by whether it opens a space for wonder and uncertainty and the acknowledgement that we don't know everything, that the past is larger than our stories about it, that reality is always more complex than our models and frameworks can capture. The Gobi Desert is vast and old. It has witnessed the rise and fall of countless species, countless ecosystems, countless eras. It was there before humans existed. It will be there long after we're gone. And in between, we get this brief moment to wonder about it, to explore it, to try to read its records and understand its history. Mostly we find what we expect. Evidence of dinosaurs. Evidence of early mammals. Evidence of ancient climates and geological processes that shaped the landscape over millions of years. These are important findings. They teach us much about the history of life on Earth, about evolution and extinction and the deep rhythms of planetary change. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone finds something else. Something that doesn't quite fit. Something that raises questions rather than answering them. And what we do with those findings, how we respond to them, whether we preserve them or dismiss them or simply lose them, that shapes what we know and what we can know about the past. Grachev found something. We don't know what exactly. We only know he thought it was significant, thought it challenged his understanding, thought it was worth documenting even if he wasn't ready to share it. And now it's gone. The stone, the site, the witness, all gone. Leaving only a sketch and a question and the reminder that knowledge is fragile, that understanding is provisional, that most of what has ever existed is lost to us now. And we're building our picture of the past from the tiny fraction that happened to survive, happened to be found, happened to be recognized for what it was. It's not much to build on, but it's what we have. And so we build carefully, humbly, always aware that the foundation is incomplete, that there are gaps we don't see, that the next discovery might require us to adjust everything we thought we understood. This is not a weakness. This is how knowledge works, how it has always worked. We propose, test, we revise, we build slowly toward understanding, knowing we'll never arrive at complete certainty but getting closer, gradually, through iteration and correction and the accumulation of evidence. And sometimes we lose evidence along the way. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we overlook things or dismiss them too quickly or simply fail to recognize their significance until it's too late. This is human. This is inevitable. We do our best with limited resources and limited time and limited understanding. And we accept that the picture we build will always be incomplete, always provisional, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges or old evidence is reinterpreted. The Gobi Desert doesn't care about our need for complete answers. It reveals what it reveals according to its own rhythms, its own timescales. We can search, we can document, we can try to understand, but we can't force the desert to give up its secrets on our schedule, in the form we prefer. We work with what we're given, and we remember, or should remember, that what we're given is always less than what existed, always filtered through the accidents of preservation and discovery and recognition. Grachev's stone is a reminder of that filtering, of how easily evidence can slip through our fingers, how quickly a moment of potential discovery can close and never reopen. It's gone now. Whatever it was, whatever it might have told us, it's beyond our reach. We have only the documentation of one man's observation, and that's not enough to build certainty on, barely enough to build speculation on. But it's something. Trace. Hint. A suggestion that maybe the past is not quite as settled as we sometimes think, that there might be gaps in our understanding larger than we recognize, that the Gobi Desert, like deserts everywhere, holds more than it reveals, and what it conceals might include things that would surprise us, challenge us, make us reconsider what we thought we knew. Or maybe not. Maybe the stone was nothing, a misinterpretation, an error. Maybe Grachev was wrong, and if we could examine the evidence now, we would see immediately what he missed, understand the mechanism that made a modern object appear ancient, recognize the mistake and move on. We'll never know. The evidence is lost. The question remains unanswered, unanswerable, hanging in the space between what we know and what we don't know, between the documented and the lost. And perhaps that's where it should remain. Reminder. Question mark. A small acknowledgement that for all we've learned about the past, for all we've discovered and documented and understood, there's still so much we don't know, so much we can't know, so much that's been permanently lost to time and erosion and simple human accident. The Gobi Desert is still there, under the same sun that Grachev walked beneath in the spring of 1924. The wind still blows. The rock still erodes. And somewhere in that vastness, in layers of stone laid down millions of years ago, there might be something waiting to be found. Or there might be nothing. Or there might have been something once, but it's gone now, worn away to dust, scattered to atoms beyond recovery. We don't know which of these is true. We're probably never going to know. And that's okay. Not everything has to be known. Not every question has to be answered. Some mysteries can remain mysteries, not because we failed to solve them, but because the evidence needed to solve them no longer exists, if it ever existed at all. And maybe there's something fitting about that. Maybe the past should remain partially hidden, partially unknowable, a landscape we can glimpse but never fully map, a story we can piece together but never completely tell. We do what we can. We search. We find. We document. We preserve. And we accept that it will never be complete, that there will always be gaps, always be questions, always be traces of things that existed briefly and then disappeared before we could properly examine them. Grachev's stone is one such trace. One man's observation. One afternoon in the desert. One sketch in a notebook. 3 words. Context makes no sense. It's not much. But it's enough to remind us that the past is larger than our knowledge of it, that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, that sometimes things are lost not because they weren't important but because the circumstances that would have allowed their preservation never aligned quite right. And so we hold the question lightly, without insisting on an answer, content to wonder, to acknowledge uncertainty, to accept that some things remain unknown not by choice but by necessity, by the simple fact that time is patient and thorough in its work of erasure, and we are brief and limited in our ability to preserve and understand. The desert keeps its secrets. The past remains partially hidden. And we continue our work, searching for fragments, building understanding from what survives, always aware that what we know is vastly smaller than what existed, and what existed is vastly smaller than what might have existed, and between these things lies an ocean of uncertainty that we navigate as best we can, with limited tools and limited time and limited evidence. It's enough. Has to be enough. 'Cause it's all we have. The sun sets over the Gobi Desert the same way it set on the day Grachev found his stone. The same way it will set long after we're gone. And in that light, in that vastness, one man's question, context makes no sense, echoes quietly, a reminder of all the questions we carry, all the uncertainties we live with, all the things we almost understood before they slipped away into the dark.